Living my bucolic life, free, healthy city strife. Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and sew and spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful white houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.
Okay, so welcome to another going into colder weather project. And this is what I am making, and forgive me because it is a spring looking fabric, all right? This one right here. But I'm going to be making it out of flannel, so it'll be warmer. So whereas this dress has shorter sleeves and it does have an elastic band down there, I'm going to be doing the sleeves from the longer version. But basically this big long tiered dress with the long sleeves, and you may say, and I did say, that looks strikingly similar to this jacket, okay? And I think it's because they are both 𝐃𝐨𝐬𝐤𝐿 patterns. And this one is a 𝐃𝐨𝐬𝐤 McCalls pattern. This is her simplicity version. Very similar. A couple differences that I saw is that this one has a yoke piece, okay? And it also has a longer torso area so that you can put a belt over it. If you can see, the seam line is under the waist line, whereas this one, this line seemed to be a lot shorter, at least on my body it did. And this one, of course, had cuffs, vents and cuffs. If you know, you know. This one has elastic on the cuffs, okay? So I am making it as a dress, so it will not be lined. The one that I did out of this was fully lined. This is the one that I call my �ฑ𝐢𝐤𝐞 jacket, okay? And it's out of corduroy with velvet ribbons and all kinds of extra. This is going to be flannel, but here's the thing. To do this whole long dress with all of the layers of gathers and the long sleeve takes a lot of fabric. It looks like it wants 5 3/4 fabric of 45-inch wide fabric. Now, at this point, the only flannel I have that quantity of is solid black. And I am not a solid black kind of person, but I will use it. So let me tip the camera down, tell you my game plan. All right, so I got my colored pencils and colored here. What I'm going to be doing is using 3 different flannels. So I have black, I have gray, and I have this. This is, it's 100% cotton flannel. It is a printed flannel. It's not a woven flannel, but it's printed with the checks on a bias, on a diagonal, which is kind of cool. All right, and because it has gray and it has black, I think it's going to tie it all together. So on my dress, let me see if I can bring you in even closer here. What I'm planning on doing is, like I said, this has a yoke at the top, doing the front band, the yoke, and the sleeves out of this, okay? Out of my black flannel, I'm going to be doing the main bodice piece and this lower ruffle. And then out of my gray, I'm going to be doing the middle ruffle and the collar, okay? And the gray that I'm going to be using when I was making my classic flannel shirt, remember I made this collar? And I was like, I'm going to use that at some point. Well, it actually fits this pattern. So I haven't decided if I'm just going to use this or if I feel like I should show you making it. But you know, this, I did go into detail showing how to make this collar on my video making the classic flannel shirt. So anyhow, I might use this, might not, we will see. But that's what I'm going to do. So I have cut out my pattern pieces. I haven't cut out the fabric yet. I've just kind of made stacks of my pattern pieces in the different piles depending on what fabric they'll be cut out of. And I can tell you that this is going to be very long. I'm 5'4", okay? It says for the size I'm going to be doing, which is size 16, the finished length is going to be 58 inches. Okay, you can see that down here. That is 8 inches longer than what I need. And what I do, because they measure it from like the base of your neck, so like if you were standing there, you'd put the top of the tape right up there in the back of your neck. So how I do it is I get a tape, I put a safety pin where they say the finished length is, and hold it up and put the beginning of the tape at the base of my neck. And just look in the mirror and get an idea of where it's going to line up. And this is dragging on the floor a few inches. So I don't want it to drag on the floor and I don't want it to be floor length. I want it to be, you know, about 4 inches or 5 inches off the floor. So I figure if I take 8 inches off, it'll give me the finished length I want. And the way I am going to do that is I'm going to take 4 inches off of this ruffle and 4 inches off of this ruffle. So they'll both kind of stay the same proportion, but just shorter versions of them. So when I go to cut them out, you will see I'm just going to fold up the bottom of those because they are just rectangles. So I don't really need to make that cut. I can just fold them. So with that, I'm going to get started cutting this out. If I see anything crazy, I will stop, turn on the camera and tell you. But that's the game plan. That's the way I'm going to cut everything out, and I will be right back. Wait out. Before I got too far, I have pre-washed in hot, pre-dried on hot all of my fabric to try to get all of the shrink out of it that I can. And on flannel, I tear the edge to make sure I get the straight lined up before I start cutting anything. But on this piece, because it is a print, and I just have it turned right side down, you know, because it's easier on my eyes this way. But I am lining up the grain line according to the print. So if I can see, all right, if I put my grain line so it's just on this side of this diamond, I want it to stay on that side of the diamond. I need to move it over because I'm just a hair off my table. Okay, so that's how I'm doing it, and the sleeves thankfully are very wide, so I don't need to do any sleeve adjustments, so that's really nice. And they're very like bell shaped, so when you put the elastic in, the bottom should have a nice full drape. I also want to show you, I was cutting out these one at a time. So I cut out the one, you know, like you saw me do with the wrong side up, and then I placed that entire piece down on my fabric right side up so that I could line up my design exactly on that, okay? And now I'm going to cut that out, but that's how I'm working this. Now this front band, where all the buttons are going to go, I need to shorten it by the same 8 inches that I am shortening everything else at. So I am just going to line up my ruler on the bottom, make sure it's straight, draw my line and cut that whole bottom piece off here, and then use my shortened piece to cut my button band off the front. Now this is going to be a double-sided button band on both sides, so you need to cut 4 of them. So something I noticed as I'm cutting out, when I got up to these yokes, I am really used to having a yoke on the outside and a lining yoke on the inside, just because it keeps everything nice and neat in there. But this pattern does not have the yoke faced. It is just the seam is exposed and everything, so yeah, I went ahead, I wasn't paying attention, I went ahead and cut an extra one out, but I will just set that aside, not needed. So you're only cutting 2 of the front yoke piece and 1 back one on fold and calling that good. All right, so I am moving on to the black fabric, which means I need to cut out my lower ruffle. And if you remember, I need to shorten this piece by 4 inches. So I'm just going to set it up on my little grid here so I can see it easier. And draw a line straight across where that 4-inch mark is. I will be using my ruler to fold it, but I want to have a line just in case something goes wrong. So what I do then is I put my ruler right next to that line, hold it really steady, and just pop it up. Okay, so I have my flannel laid out here. Let's see if you can see it. It is just a couple inches wider than my piece. And since all this is going to be gathered, to me, it makes no sense to trim out a little piece. So what I'm going to do for all 4 of these pieces is just tear it, okay? So I tore the top, so this top is on the straight. So then, actually, let me just measure this piece and see how long are you. From top to bottom, it's 13¼ inches. So then I'm going to find my selvage edge side here. This is I bought this bolt of black flannel. It was an odd lot where it had been a leftover from a manufacturing, so it used to be one of those super wide ones, so one side doesn't have a selvage, one side does, you know. And so what I'm going to do is just clip it. So I'm just going to tear 4 long strips at 13 3/8 of an inch wide. On these front piece, well, the bodice piece, the front and back, there's an option for this top here where there's an extra piece down below, but doing the dress option, I cut that off. So if you're doing the blouse, you're basically going to be building it the way I'm doing it for the dress. You just won't do the ruffle at the bottom, but also your bodice piece will be a little bit longer. So this is my top ruffle, and I'm going to shorten it by 4 inches. There's a different piece for the back that there is for the front. So I'm going to shorten both of them by 4 inches, just like I did the bottom one. The front one, you just cut 2 of these, you know, because there's a center opening here. The back one, you cut 1 on a fold. All right, I did decide to use the collar from the pattern instead of my one I have already made, because I'm thinking that someone will probably get very concerned if I don't explain how to make the collar the entire way, you know, because it can be tricky to have to refer back to another video for that part. So I will just put that aside. But I can tell you right now, all of this flannel, I'm going to have to serge around every single piece. And I'm going to do that off camera. Just assume I'm serging around everything, because this stuff, especially the pieces that I tore, really wants to fray. So I'll be changing my serger thread to black and just using black for this whole project. So I've got my black thread on my serger. It's actually been a couple days since I've been up here. Yesterday was very busy, but here I am. So the first piece I'm going to work on is my front and getting my front connected to my front yoke piece, okay? So what I need to do is find my scrap of leather, new one. The other one was getting a little bit weak. Punch out these holes. These holes up at the top are the ones that are marking where the gathering is going to be. So there's a little bit of, you know, gather up there at the yoke. So I got those punched. I'm going to clip these notches, and this is pretty much how I'm going to clip them for the whole pattern. It's just clip up to. McCalls notches are not as big as some other companies, so I go up to the top. On my dark fabric, I'm going to use my chalk pencil just because it shows up better. The heat erasable white pens don't work as well as the darker color, so in general I use this for black. So I need to go ahead and put these marks on the other side. Okay, so these are my 2 wrinkled pieces. I will iron it when I'm pressing the yoke on there, but you know, I'm not going to do it right now. I've serged the edges, and between these two dots, I ran a row of gathering stitches at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that way it's close enough to where I'm going to sew that it shouldn't get out of whack, but hopefully those stitches will not show. So let me just set this aside here for a minute. Get this piece out. This is the front yoke that's going to go on there, and I'm going to clip my notches. And I will be also serging around, you know, all of that. There's a few dots I need to punch through. These two down here are the ones that are matching up with my front bodice. So there's one there, one here that you pick according to your size. And then over here there's one that's going to be useful for sleeve placement. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those on both pieces, serge around these pieces, and then we'll sew them onto the other. Okay, let me just show you on this one. I did not serge around the neckline, and that is because I'm going to be trimming my neckline before I apply the collar and collar band, so that part I didn't, but from the shoulder all the way around. The only pieces on this entire thing I'm not serging all the way around is just the neckline. Maybe. As far as I know at this point. Okay, so what I need to do is pin these together. So first thing I'm going to do is grab one of my bobbin threads, because they're easier to pull, and just pull some gathers up into this little space here. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I got to match up this dot here on my facing. Okay, so putting it face down, match this dot up with this dot, and get that pinned. You know, there's a little notch, all of that. And also on the other side, I'm going to do the edge here first. And I want to make sure that the dot I drew on my little yoke part is going to match up with the dot on my bodice. Okay, so now flipping it this way, I can see what I've got here, so I can make any adjustments, tug a little bit more if I need to, and just spread those out. This is, if this was a longer gather, I would have run 2 rows of stitching, you know, but it's only a couple inches, so it's not critical. So now that I've pinned this, what I need to do is carefully come back and stitch it. Now when I stitch it, I'm going to watch this side. For things like this, something like this, or something pokey, like even a seam ripper, can come in really handy. And what I would do is watching this side, just very carefully as you stitch, slow it down. You can make sure that nothing's getting out of whack and just sew straight across. If you're looking at this side, sometimes things can fold over, or the spacing gets bunched up in one side and not the other. I brought the camera over here because there's going to be so many gathers on this dress. I figured I would show you once, because the same way that I do this is how I'm going to do all the gathers on the skirt and everything, which is when I'm sewing it, I'm looking at the gathered side. All right, so I'm just using a stitch that's about 2.5 millimeters. That's how my machine is gauged. I'm not sure what that is. American gauge. Okay, so I'm just going to crank on up to that first dot where all my gathers start. Grab my awl. I can just kind of hold both sides and carefully go over. Okay, and then I can pull out the next pin, get everything situated nicely, hold it down on both sides, go over. Pull out the next pin, situate everything the way I want, hold down both sides, and go over. And yes, it does take a little bit longer that way, but you don't have to go back and unpick things. And in the long run, that saves me time. So now I can pull this out and open this up. So I don't know if you can see, I've got all my gathers right there. Nothing is bunched. We're all good. I'm going to go ahead and press this. Now in the instructions, what they want you to do is after you've done one row of stitching, they want you to come back a 1/4 inch above that and run a second row. I am, but instead of doing it this way, I am going to top stitch it. That's just, you know, I need to unload that. It's just a choice, you know, a stylistic choice, and I have decided I want top stitching on this one. So when I go to run my second row of stitching, I'm just doing it on top here. Oops, there's a thread I need to cut. And I will also be top stitching all of the gathers on my skirt panels too, because those are going to be heavy, and having an extra row of top stitching up there is going to hold it a lot more secure and a lot more flat for me. So now that is what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to do the other side, and then we will move on to the bodice back pieces. All right, so now I have my back and my back yoke. Very similar what I'm going to do here. The only difference is the backs are cut on a fold, and just like the front also, mark. Well, there's only one dot. I'm sorry, there's one dot on each side because we're only gathering in the center back. So I'm going to mark this dot, my sleeve dot, and serge around everywhere except for the neckline. Okay, so at this point I have my back yoke. I have serged everywhere except the neckline again, all the way around, and I just put a couple pins where my dots were because my white dots were kind of blending in there. So I got those 2 marked. Now on my back piece, I have 2 dots on here, right there. I have 2 dots. I need to run a row of gathering stitches between those 2 dots. I'll do that at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now that I have a row of gathering stitches, those are my tails. Just like last time, I'm going to pin this on. I am looking at the wrong side here. I have it all pinned onto my yoke. I'm going to pull a bobbin thread to gather this in. So I could probably pull one on this side too. Try to make it somewhat even. There, and as soon as it kind of fits, then I can go ahead, space it out, maybe put a pin in the middle, go to my sewing machine, and once again looking at this side as I sew it, making sure I get my gathers nice and even as I'm stitching it along. So I'll sew this down here at 5/8 inch also. Okay, so I have my back put together, I've got my fronts here put together, and I want to talk about strategy here, because what the instructions are going to want you to do, sew the backs to the fronts at the shoulders and the sides, and then they want you to go straight into putting the skirt on, okay? And then saving the collar and the sleeves for last. I want to put the sleeves on while it's a lot lighter because there's a lot of turning and everything, and it's easier to manipulate a piece that's this big than a piece that has all of those huge skirts, because this is going to get very heavy by the time I have all the skirts on there. So one thing it does not have is there is nothing reinforcing these curves around the collar to keep them stretching out of shape. So I am going to go ahead before I do anything else, and on the wrong side I am going to fuse 1 centimeter wide stay tape on here. I have a black one, so that will blend really well, but that's going to keep this from wanting to stretch out of shape while I'm doing sleeves and while I'm doing the skirt. I want my collar to stay put. Now I am going to be trimming down this collar line, but if I put the stay tape on now, even if I trim it later, it's going to hold that shape until I need to cut it. So I'm going to go ahead to my ironing board and do that. Alright, so I've got my stay tape on. I'm trying to give you a look. You can see it's the one that's on a bias, but it has a little straight tape stitched onto it. This is the part of it that's going to keep it from stretching out. So got that done, and what I'm going to do now is just pin the shoulders and the side seams and sew them both at 5/8 of an inch. Once I have them sewed, I will be pressing both of them open like that. Alright, so at this point, this is pretty much done as far as a bodice. I've got, you can see through here, my seam allowance is pressed open on the shoulder, and down here on the side. So I am just going to pop this over onto my dress form where it can just wait things out while we work on the sleeves. Okay, so like I mentioned before, I'm doing the longest sleeve version here, which is this big one, big bottom with elastic. This is the elastic guide. Set that aside for a minute. And of course, I am going to be serging around it. I am going to clip my notches. There are dots that are going to match up to the dots that we marked on the bodice. But after I clip my notches and serge around it and mark my dots, I'm going to have to run some gathering stitches. And because I was having so much trouble getting the little white dot to show up on my white plaid, I just actually put a little clip where those notches are. Be easier for me. So I have a double down here, a single over here, and everything up here I know is dots. And before I walk away from my table, that is not showing up very well. I get a black pen. I'm marking a big letter B on the back corner, just so I can keep track of that easier. This will iron off, but for right now, it's just easier for me to see that letter B than looking for the little double notches on here. So I have it serged around, but I am going to come back and draw big lines where I clip those notches for those dots, just because it makes it a lot easier for me to see that way. And so when I go to actually sew it on, it's not going to be that big of a deal to match it up. So I got my double notches here, a line here, center here, and that one. So I'm going to do that for both. Then I need to do gathering stitches. And you're actually going to make your gathering stitches from notch to notch. So here, all the way around, I'm going to run two rows of stitching, one at 1/2 inch seam allowance and one at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, from this notch all the way around over to here. All right, so I've got my gathering stitches put in here, and now I need to sew this seam up the whole side of my sleeve, or the underarm, all the way up here at 5/8 of an inch, and then when I'm done, I'm going to stick a sleeve roll inside and press this open. All right, so I'm going to make a slight change. The pattern calls for a 1/4 inch elastic. I'm going to use a wider one. This is closer to 1/2 inch, just because my flannel is so thick. I'm afraid that my 1/4 inch elastic just wouldn't have the oomph to cinch in all of this. And if I want to push it up on my arms, I want something that's going to be strong enough to hold it up, but not bind onto me, you know? So anyhow, this is what I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 lengths of this elastic using the pattern piece that comes along with it. And so because I'm using a wider elastic, I'm going to be making a wider hem at the bottom. The pattern has a fold line printed on it for the elastic casing, but that is a 5/8, no, it's a 3/4 inch space between the cut edge and that fold line. And I want mine a little bit bigger. This is a very big blousey sleeves. There's plenty of room in there. So I am actually going to fold this up and press it up at a 1 inch, just with the raw edge straight up. Once I have it pressed with my 1 inch, because I want to have plenty of room to move this through, okay? Then I'll turn it under. But before I do any of that, because this is the feeding elastic through, I'm going to rip a little piece of stitch witchery and fuse the bottom couple inches of each seam allowance on both I can't even speak. I'm going to use stitch witchery to fuse down the seam allowances on both sides, on both sleeves, probably about, what is that, maybe 4 inches down. And that's going to give me plenty of space to make my hem and everything, and that way I won't have any trouble trying to feed elastic through something that's going to bind me up like that. Alright, so I have it pressed, so my crease down here has been ironed. Now I need to turn my edge under So I'm just going to kind of work my way around, turning it under far enough that I don't see any, hang on a second, so I don't see any of my serging. So it's going to be about 1/4 inch. And just work my way around here, putting pins in. When I'm all done, I'll have it pinned all the way around. 1 second. Throwing pins around as I do. All right, so here it is. This side here I've already pinned all the way around, you know. And so I'm going to come back and top stitch it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start right here, okay? Right here, and then work my way around and end right here, so my opening is in the center of my little seam allowance area. For this shirt, I think that's going to work out well. But again, I do have these fused down, so it shouldn't be a problem. So starting here, edge stitching around, and ending right here on both sleeves. I've got it edge stitched on, and now I'm just going to put my elastic onto my bodkin. If you don't have one, I highly recommend a bodkin for fishing elastic through things. Punch it in here and just carefully work it through. I'm going to get a little pin and pin this end out here to my seam allowance so it won't sneak in on me, but I'm just going to try to be careful so that I don't twist up my elastic as I work through. Alright, so I got it all the way through. Pull a little extra through here so it won't sneak back in on me. Unpin this side and make sure that they are flat and going the right way. Okay, so this is a fairly thin elastic, so I'm just going to stitch it together just by overlapping it. I'm going to do it by hand. This isn't big enough to put under my machine right now, but I can just stitch it along the sides, on both sides, and then like a big X in the middle. Okay, there we are. Just doing a couple back stitches, and as always a sideways one to lock it in. Clip that off and let it pop into place down here. Okay. There's a lot of gather on that elastic. See how round that is? So what I need to do now is just come back with a little black piece of thread on a needle and stitch this little bit closed, or else it's going to be popping open and bothering me. Alrighty, so with the sleeves pretty much done, now I'm going to turn the sleeve right side out. Okay, paying attention to which side is the back. This is my back side. Okay, got my letter B, got my double notches. This is my back side. So I want to put this into a top where, or into a side where this matches up with the back. This is the front, so it is not this side. Let me move it over. If I match up, excuse me, if I match up the bottom with this one, the back side here, okay, my back side is going to go with the back side of the blouse. So that's the side I want. So turning it so I can look at it from this side, I'm just going to start pinning my underarm, my notches, and my center top up here first. Where I have that center top line, it's going to match up with the shoulder seam up here at the top. Okay, so I've got those two. I've got, let me pull my gathering threads up and out of the way here. All right, so I've got a little notch here that I'm going to match up. And on this side. And then once I have that done, I want to take a look at it and see exactly how much gathering I'm going to need to do to make this fit. So if I look at it, not very much. There's not very much I need to do. So let me start on this side. I'm just going to pull these two threads from the inside here and kind of ease them up towards the top. I'm just going to work on one side at a time. I do have a dot on here, and there's one right here. Remember, I drew a line where my dot is on my sleeve, so I can match that up with this point. Put a pin right there. And with that done, I can see that this is pretty much in there. What I'm looking at right now is the gathering stitches. All of the gather is out here. At the actual stitching line, it's pretty flat. Let's see what it looks like down here. I think it's about the same. So we shouldn't be seeing very much in the way of any gathers or puckers up here. You know, it looks like all of the gathers, all of the ruffly part is in the seam allowance. Okay, so the front side is all pinned in. I'm gonna grab my 2 threads and pull up some gathers in the back. Kind of push some up towards the top. I need to match my dot on my sleeve. Oh, where is that dot? It disappeared. I think that's it. Let me double check where that dot is on here and I'll mark it better. Okay, that dot is right here. The white blended in right there. So I kind of lost track of it, but now I can match up where this line meets with this line. Okay. So again, because sometimes the back has more ease than the front. Take a peek at it. Well, it does not look to be the case here. Actually, I'm going to pull that pin out for a second because it looks like it's going to be very similar where all of the ruffly part is in the seam allowance, but right around here is fairly straight. And the same right here. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it and sew it. And again, when I'm sewing it, I want to be able to see what's going on in here, but at the same time, it's easier to ease from the underneath, all right? So the sleeve cap here is the only exception where I'm putting the gathered part underneath. On the skirt, it's going to be on top, but on here, I want it underneath because as I sew, if I need to ease something in, it's a lot easier for me to do it that way. Okay, so I sewed it all the way around and then came back in between these 2 notches, made a second row of stitching, about 1/8 of an inch in from there. And I am actually just going to clip this. Sometimes I pink it, sometimes I trim it. I'm just going to clip it this time, you know. Use your own judgment on your own projects. But I'm just clipping up to probably about within 1/8 of an inch of that row of stitching so that it can open up and flex and give me room. But having 2 rows of stitching, that makes sure that 1, your seam has a lot of extra strength, but also this clip is not going to run all the way through. So if I open this up now, how does it look? I have no puckers, so that's good. That's what we want, is a nice little sleeve head with no puckers on it. You know, and I am doing diagonal with diagonal, so no matching, but that's okay. That's all right. It doesn't bother me. Hope it doesn't bother you. If it does, sorry about that. Life will go on. But anyway, let me go ahead and sew on the other sleeve, and I'll put it on my dress form and show you what it looks like so far. All right, so this is her so far with her little diagonal plaid, which is kind of fun. I do like that on the sleeves. The elastic down here. This is how it is looking. The bottom is coming, well, it's way past waist level. It's like very high hip level here, so that's good. So here is the front, and these 2 are just meeting here, but that's okay because there's going to be a band that's overlapping, so that's how it's supposed to be. And then if I turn it, just ignore that none of the plaids are matching. It's fine. This is the back. As you can see, it is gathered in that center area. This very center plaid crossing matches up with the center back, so at least I have that going for me. But there's the sleeves, and I think it's pretty good so far. All right, so now I'm gonna back up in the directions back here. And this is where we're gonna be putting together the middle part of the skirt, this layer right here. So there's a back piece, which is twice as long as the front pieces. And mine, of course, are shorter than the original because I did shorten both of my skirt pieces by 4 inches. So this long one here is my back, and I have already serged around it. I have not ironed it, obviously. It's pretty wrinkled. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and sew my front panels to each side so I end up with one large strip before I put my gathering stitches on. So I will sew these on, you know, one at each side. So I go front, back, and then front at 5/8 of an inch, and I will be pressing these seam allowances open. Now for the gathering stitches, this is going to be one very, very long, let me back you up, very, very long row of gathering stitches, starting in the front, going all the way and ending in the front, okay? Because it's so long and because this is, you know, flannel, sturdy, I'm using my super thread. So if you haven't seen this before, it's basically a kind of thread-like fishing line. And I can't tell you exactly the brand or anything because I actually bought it at a yard sale many, many, many years ago. But you know, one big old spool lasts forever. I put it on my bobbin. It doesn't go through my needle, it only goes through my bobbin. But it is so strong. This is just, you know, medical supplies to hold it all together here. But it is so strong that it will not break. It, you know, guarantee, it will not break, so that I can pull and pull and pull, because this is going to be a very long strip, especially when I get to the lower ruffle, which is going to be, you know, twice as wide as this. So let me get the side seam sewed, pressed open, and then I'm going to be running 2 rows of gathering stitches, you know, my regular thread in my needle, this in my bobbin, one at 1/2 inch and one at 3/8 of an inch. All right, so I've got all of my gathering stitches put in. So one side is the black thread, one side is my super thread. This is the side with the seam allowance, so that should be the inside. So what I'm actually going to do before I get started is mark where my centers of these pieces are, because that's going to help me when I'm doing my first round of gathering. So let me just put a dot here. Okay, that's going to be my center back place. And then I have these. Okay, so that'll I need to figure out how to turn off certain notifications on my phone. It just keeps going. So anyhow, what I'm going to do, fold these two together. This is my bodice, obviously, and this is my back, and so I can find my center back place here, match it up here. Got my right sides together and start pinning. I'm going to actually be like pinning and splitting the difference and pinning and splitting the difference a few times before I start pulling my gathering threads. It's just going to help me that way. So I'm pinning my side seams, and then I will pin my front edges so that those are matching. Okay, and then I'll come back and go halfway between each of those. So I can find that spot, pin that together, and so on and so forth until, you know, I have a pin like every 6 inches or so on my bodice part all the way around. Placing 2 pins at my center back, because I'm going to pull this side that way, that side that way, and I need to be able to see where to stop pulling. So I am pulling my bobbin threads. Even if you don't use a super thread, pull your bobbin threads instead of your needle threads. It'll go a lot easier for you. So I'm just going to wrap these super threads around and just be pulling them and moving everything down. Because I do 2 rows of stitching for my gathers, it's gonna lay a lot flatter, so that should make it nice. But I'm just gonna keep working my way with my gathers all the way to my center back. And once I have enough gathers in between 2 pins where it's gonna lay nice and flat up here at my center back, then I'll work to the next one, the next one, the next one. Just, you know, the normal gathering methods. All right, I've got it all pinned on and gathered together, and it's not an excessive amount of gathers. You know, they're actually fairly loose gathers. But the next row will probably be as tight or maybe a little bit tighter. But I'm going to go ahead and sew it, and as I said, I'm going to sew it with this side up. That way I can adjust the gathers if I need to, and I can make sure that my stitching line is beyond my gathering threads so that they won't show. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on my machine, sew it down at 5/8. Then after I sew it, I'm going to open it up, press this up, and top stitch it on the outside. All right, so I have this just sewed on, and I wanted to show you I have pressed the seam allowances up, and now I'm going to come back and run an edging top stitch type thing, probably about 1/8 of an inch in. Very, very similar to what I did right here on this yoke, all the way across. And that's an extra row of stitching is definitely going to help the strength of this. All right, so you have to kind of imagine it with a belt. Maybe I'll put one on for the next time. But I just wanted to show you the length of just putting the one ruffle on. It's actually a cute little short skirt if you've got the legs for it. But I need to get started with the bottom layer now. Okay, so the bottom layer is going to be 4 very long rectangles. So before I do anything, I'm going to go over and serge around the edges of all of these pieces and iron them while they're separate. I think that'll be easier to do. Okay, so I have them all serged around and ironed, and now I am going to sew them end to end to make one extremely long strip, an extremely long rectangle. And I'll come back and press all of these seam allowances open again, as the typical 5/8 of an inch, like that. All right, so got my very long strip here, got my seam allowances pressed open, and now just like the gray one, I'm going to be doing 2 rows of gathering stitches across the top using my super thread in the bobbin, 1 row at 1/2 inch, 1 row at 3/8 of an inch, and I'm just doing one big long strip all the way from the very beginning over here to the end over here. And now I just have a lot of gathering to do. So there are 4 different strips sewed together here. Basically 1 strip is just covering the front area, 2 strips cover the back area, and then 1 strip covers the other area. Matching seam allowances. The center back of this will have a seam allowance in it. So let me get it matched up, gathered in and pinned, and I'll show you how defined these gathers are going to be. Alrighty, I am almost done gathering this, and I'm going to call it quits for the night. It's getting late, and I've got other things to do, but I wanted to show you something that I do, especially on a long gather like this, because there's a tendency, especially with 2 strands or more, that as you're pulling and as you're adjusting, especially like when I was like pushing things all the way down, like as I pull it, I'll make a little knot right here in my threads so that at least at that point they can't separate and one can't go farther than the other. So if you see, I've got like little knots going all over here, you know, but that helps me so that one thread doesn't, you know, get out of whack. But got it done, extremely wide. This is going to be a very full skirt. So tomorrow morning I will sew this, and it's going to be the same as this layer here where I sew it, press the seam allowance up, and then come back and do like an 1/8 inch or even Yeah, that's about an 1/8 inch up top stitching down the upper part of it, just to reinforce it and hold it down flat. Good morning. Do we have volume? Yes, we do. Okay, great. Good morning. Welcome to another day. I think it's like 3rd day on this, but you know, I have life. So I put a belt on here just so you can get an idea of what the silhouette's going to be. You know, this isn't my favorite belt. It's just one that I had in the room here. But I will be wearing a belt with this dress, so it kind of pulls it in. It gives it a slightly different look. So, you know, of course, you know, sleeves and everything. But let me move the camera down so you can see how long this is getting. Move my stuff out of the way here. So, I don't know if you can tell, but this is an extremely full bottom ruffle. So the middle ruffle not quite as much, but the bottom ruffle very full. I'm really liking that. And it's coming together well. I like it. So what I need to work on today is going to be this front placket here and the collar band. Actually, before I can work on that band, I need to hem the bottom. And the pattern just calls for a narrow hem, and a narrow hem it shall be. So just folding it up, you know, eyeballing it. For me, I'm going to do about 3/4 of an inch up, and then just tuck it under. So I end up with a hem that looks like about 3/8 of an inch. I like that better than the little 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch ones. They seem to lay flatter for me when I press them. So anyhow, I kind of adjusted the finished length before I even cut out the pieces. So when I adjusted how much I was going to cut off each piece, I kind of did it with a hem of this size in mind. So anyhow, there we go. If you are making this dress and you didn't adjust it beforehand, you can try it on right now. So that's a good thing. So I'm just going to go ahead, pin this all the way, and then edge stitch it across the top on my machine all the way around. Now I wanted to show you my seam allowances are kind of thick. You know, it's not a dire emergency, but it is thicker. So I'm just going to draw with my little chalk a line that is roughly where it's going to be hidden. Okay, taking my pin off, I am going to clip out about a 1/2 inch down from that mark so I can guarantee it's not going to show. I'm going to cut out most of this seam allowance down to fairly close to where that seam is. Okay, so now when I tuck it up and turn it under, it's a whole lot flatter, and that just feels very similar to over here and over here, so it's not going to stand out stiffer than the rest of the skirt as I go around. So I'll be doing that at each seam. All right, so I need to start working on my collar and my front band, and I'm using 2 different interfacings. I'm going to use one that's slightly crisper, you know, heavier and crisper for the collar, and my extremely lightweight one for the collar band and the front band. I want those to be softer. This can have a little bit more body. The one I'm using for this is this one. It's called featherweight. It feels more like a midweight to me, but you know, that's how it goes. And what I am using for my collar band and everything, the front band, is my very typically used, extremely lightweight fusible interfacing. So I've got, at this point, a piece of this black cut out the exact size as my collar piece at this point. And I'm going to go ahead and cut out the interfacing for these. This one is you cut 1 piece on fold. This is you need 2 pieces cut out of this big long band. All right, so I've got these cut, and at this point I'm just going to go ahead and fuse this really lightweight interfacing to my front, one of my front bands. Well, actually I have 4 of these cut, so 2 of them are getting interfacing, 2 of them are not. And this one, I have 2 of these cut, 1 is getting interfacing. So I'm just going to go ahead and fuse this on right now. And like I have shown so many times, I just typically don't use a press cloth. Well, sometimes I do on certain fabrics, but typically I don't. So I have my fusible dots down up against my fabric, I'm just putting my iron straight down. I use steam, lift it up, go to the next spot, and go to the next spot. This is a very lightweight interfacing, so it doesn't take a whole lot of time and a whole lot of pressure to fuse it on. Some of the heavier weight ones take more. And that is it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the front band pieces just like that. Alright, so on my table I have a uninterfaced piece on top of an interface piece, just right sides together here. Now these are going to go together a little bit differently than the standard, which is kind of fun. There is a dot up here at the very top in the center, and for each view there's also a dot that's basically 5/8 in from the bottom and 5/8 in from the side. Now, I cut 8 inches off my bottom, so I'm going to have to redraw that little dot in. So I am just going to use my little ruler to figure out where that point will be and put my dot. So I will punch that out right now. And ready to go. So, one of my facing pieces, well actually the facing is the one with interfacing. The band front is the one without interfacing. And this band front is the one that I want in the front. So it's going to be the one that I want to have buttonholes on. So I think I have these placed right because this is the one that I have cut in the most symmetrical fashion. So at this point I hope I'm doing it right. Time will tell. Actually have to flip these over and mark them on the interfacing side, not the regular side. So there we go. And what the pattern is going to want you to do is press under an edge and trim 1/4 inch off first thing on the interfacing side. I'm not going to do that yet. I am going to stitch and then I will pink along that edge and fold it, okay? But so I'm kind of skipping this, but I will come back to it. So on the top, and this is just a plain rectangle, so we can kind of just take our pick, which is which. So on the top up here, over, there's a dot in the very center. I'm going to mark that dot. On the very bottom, sounds like a haunted house squeak, doesn't it? Okay, on the very bottom here, I have my dot, which is kind of offset there. I'm going to mark that one. Flip my pattern upside down on this side and mark them both over here. Right, so I kind of scooted one of these up so you can see what I'm doing. Just ignore that my interfacing is peeking out. I will trim that right now so it's not in our way. For at least that far. I'm going to be trimming it off entirely in a minute. Okay, the dot that's just a seam allowance in each way, I'm going to fold it at that point and stick a pin up here. And what I need to do is fold this side the rest of the way up at that same 5/8 inch in. I can pretty well eyeball a 5/8 inch seam allowance at this point. If you need to put a ruler down and measure it so you get it, you know, that's good too. But just go ahead and fold it. And I'm actually going to, once I get this pinned, I'm just going to lightly iron it just so it'll kind of train it to want to be that way and give me a crease that I can use as a guideline later. Okay, so if you can see on their diagram, the bottom one where the dot is now basically right here, we're just going to sew from that point all the way up, make the turn up here at the 5/8 inch point, come all the way up here, coming up this way, make a turn back down at 5/8 at this center dot, which is this dot. This is the top here. You then make an abrupt turn and head straight north, so you have this zigzag kind of thing there. okay? And then of course you do the opposite here. So it's going to come this way and then back down, all the way down, then straight across. Okay, so I just quickly held this up to my dress, and it's short. It is shorter than my dress length is right now by about an inch. It doesn't bother me too much. As I sew my band on, I will just kind of ease it in, and it's a very long length to ease in, so that won't be a problem. But I just wanted to make sure that if that happens to you, to be aware of it so that, you know, you don't freak out over it. So, all of that being said, this part up here that has the zigzag in it, I need to cut a little piece out of there. So, in this diagonal here, I cut up to that thread. Just make sure I am doing it the way they want. It's hard to tell exactly what they want, huh? All right, so I'm just cutting up to this thread here, and I am going to widen that out and take out some of that bulk like this, okay? The rest of this, I'm going to pink, and I'm going to pink it so that the closest zigzag is about 1/8 of an inch away, give or take. Pinking is fabulous for a band like this with thicker fabric because it's mystical. You can't tell exactly where it ends when you turn it. So you don't have like one set band, one set line where there's obviously an end of seam allowances. It's like here or there, or here or there. We just don't know. So anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and pink all the way down both of these strips. All right, so now that that is done, I need to understitch this. And on this piece, the interface side is the private side. That's going to be the backing. The one without it is going to be the visible side to the public. So I am pushing my seam allowances towards my interface side, okay? And from the right side, I will very carefully do a row of understitching very close to this edge, right about here, about 1/16 of an inch away from this very edge, all the way down. Can't get up into the very corners because it's a corner, but as close as you can start, probably about an inch or so down, go all the way down to the bottom of the strip, and do that on both the right and the left side. Okay, so you can see my understitching got to within about an inch of the very bottom there, and the same at the top. All right, so it's just holding that over. So the idea, you know, in my pinking, clipped out that, the idea is that when you turn it, just poke this corner out a little bit, when you turn it, the understitching is going to want to pull the fabric on the right side over and around to the back here, okay? And it'll give a really nice edge. All right, so what I need to do now, let me flip this back out, is, remember I said I will deal with trimming this edge later. Well, it's time for me to trim it. And what I'm going to do, again, is I'm going to pink it, but I'm not going to pink it as deeply as the last one. This one, I'm just going to pink the very edge, like this, just so that the edge is zigzaggy. And that is because if I clip it too short, because this is an edge that we're going to need to pull over and match up to a finished edge on the inside and everything, I want to have enough seam allowance here that if I need to make an adjustment for some odd reason, I can. All right, so I'm just trimming off the edge like that. So at this point, I should have a long uninterfaced edge that I'm going to use to sew onto my dress. Everything's pinked up here, this is pinked and understitched here, and now what I'm going to do is go ahead and iron it very carefully, you know, to try to get this edge exactly where I want it, like this. Make sure everything looks nice. Iron both of these strips. All right, so I have my strip here, and the part with the little step zigzag thing is the top, all right? So I'm going to line up that very top. This opens, so I'm just going to try to push that opening part out of the way. And because, you know, I said that it's a little bit shorter, when I do this, actually, let me go ahead and pin it down to the yoke piece right here. So I'm going to get this part at the top pinned, and then I'm going to come down and pin this at the bottom. And down here, I'm just opening it all up and laying it in here. I'm going to pin this very bottom. Now I'm going to pin my facing so that it is slightly longer, so that it, like, you can see it's sticking out just a hair longer, a little less than 1/8 of an inch. All right, and that is because that'll give me room for this facing to wrap around and enclose it without having anything get bunchy in there, okay? So now that I have my top and my bottom, I'm just gonna stretch this and fluff it out, lay it down. Oh my gosh, I have so many layers under here. Lay it back down here and try to very carefully and sensitively pin it so that I don't have any you know, wrinkles or anything like that in there, but that I can kind of just work in the stretch. And you know what? When it's hanging up and it has all of that stress from gravity, because this is getting heavier because it's so big, I think it's stretched out more. So laying it flat and being able to kind of like gently swoosh it together, it's going to lay out flat. I'm going to be able to pin it and sew it on just fine. So that's a good thing. So I'm going to go ahead, open this up, and carefully pin it all the way down the side. And then once I have it pinned, I will come back and stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, let me see if I can explain this so it makes sense. I have this side is the side that I've sewn, the one that's on top. And what I am doing right now is trying to very carefully match up where the seam is of the color change of the skirt on the facing over here. So like, get a pen here. So I have it pinned together up at the yoke, all right, where those two are matched up. And let me move my little band down here. I just have my band pinned to the very bottom. Okay, it's not pinned to the dress on the bottom here. And I am trying, because if I don't get, because I did a little bit of easing and everything, I need my dress to look the same on both sides of the band. I can adjust it a little bit with button placement, but not a whole lot. Okay, so like right here, I can see this seam here is where the gray joins with the black. And that is sewn onto my front band right here. Okay, so if I open it up, it's right there, it's right there. So here it is on the one I already sewed. When I match these two bands up together, I need to make sure that this line right here that I'm drawing on this band is going to match up on this side to where the gray and the black come together, if that makes some sense. And when you're doing this, make sure that, see that? I kind of have my seam allowance messed up a little bit. I'll fix that, but you want your seam allowances to be pushed up. But the main thing here is to make sure that the seam where those two colors come together. That way, when I go to button it on this side of the band and on that side of the band, it'll be the same color change. Okay, so let me put a pin right here and look at this one down here. So I just kind of have it pinned in place where the two layers of band are the same length. So on this, if I stick stick a pin straight through that stitching in the band, I can see, all right, this is where that seam line is, okay? So then when I put that right next to the seam allowance of the other band, I can just continue that line. Like I said, you can fudge it a little bit with button placement, but just as close as you can get, the better. So now I can take my band and place it so that this line I drew is going to line up to where that color change happens. Okay? And then I can just ease everything in between here, you know, ease in everything in between here, but at least these major placements, which is what's going to be obvious if they're screwed up, at least those are correct. Okay, so I just pinned this on my dress form, and I am just so ecstatic. Look at this matching. Ah! This is my band right here. This is my center front. Look at that matching. I am always so excited when a plan comes together, you know, but that couldn't be better. Just so excited about that. But the reason I pinned it together is I wanted to make sure that, like here, this line is right. Coming down here, this line is right. So on this side is the same as that side. And down here, they match up too. But just wanted to show you, I'm just having a little celebration moment right here. And I'm just really happy that this lined up too. And this lined up, so far so good. I'm actually going to take a really quick break, run downstairs, refresh my coffee cup, and we will get on to the collar. Okay, so about ready to get started on the collar, and I'm going to be doing my collar differently than the directions do. You know, just letting you know off top of the process here. The first thing I'm going to do is take 1/2 inch off of the sides of my interfacing here on my collar. And I say 1/2 inch, seam allowance is 5/8, but by the time I put my fat little pencil next to the 1/2 inch mark, it comes to 5/8. So I'm just going to slice that off. And then I am also going to take the seam allowance off of the bottom. So again, I will mark it at 1/2 inch, oops, wrong pen, at a 1/2 inch all the way, and then come back and just cut that off. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and fuse this to one of my collar pieces. I can match up the top, but I should have 5/8 or thereabouts available on each side and down here. So I'm going to go ahead and just fuse this on really quick. All right, so now I have my interfacing, one piece of fabric and another piece of fabric that is not interfaced, okay? And I am going to just sew straight across the top, just putting a couple pins to hold it here, straight across here from edge to edge at 5/8 of an inch. And now that I have this stitched, I am going to come back and trim it with my pinking shears fairly close. You can see it's fairly close to the stitching all the way across here. So now on this pattern, the side with interfacing is the private side. They want the side that is not interfaced to be the public side. So I'm going to understitch this seam we just put in. And so this seam allowance, small as it is going to be pressed towards the interface side. And I'm going to sew it, actually it'll be like this on my sewing machine, a row of understitching really close, about 1/16 of an inch, about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam line here, right here, and that is holding my little bitty pink seam allowance down. Okay, so this is what it looks like on the inside. This is my seam, this is my row of understitching, and of course my pinked edge. You know, it's all really close together. If you need to do your pinking a little farther out and leave like 1/4 of an inch just so you have plenty of room to move it over, you can do that, that's fine. So now what I need to do is the sides of the collar. And what I want is to fold, well, there's a couple things I'm going to be doing differently. First of all, when I fold it, I want to fold it so that all of this curve and the understitching and everything is coming over the top. So at the very top edge, all I'm seeing is nice uninterfaced fabric right up here, okay? Now, I want my interfaced side of my finished collar to be shorter than my uninterfaced side. So I'm basically not going to line it up exact. I'm going to be pulling my non-interfaced one in. So at the very bottom here, I have probably just over 1/8 of an inch difference, okay? So I'm going to put a pin right there. Push that head in a little bit. And just to make it easier while I'm stitching, so I can get a nice, use my guide on my machine, I'm going to trim that off, okay? So let me do that on this side also, making sure that I fold it. So at the very top edge, all I have is uninterfaced fabric. And on the interfaced side, I want that to stick out at least 1/8 of an inch on the bottom. I'm going to pin this. And then trim that little bit of extra off. And go ahead and sew up these side seams at 5/8 of an inch. So when I'm stitching it, I start out at the very top at 5/8. At the very bottom, my seam allowance is 1/2 inch. And I just kind of work my way down and glide between 5/8 to 1/2 all the way down. In that way, it's going to make up the difference for what I shortened that one side pretty much. So I'm going to clip that. Take a little chunk in there so that my corner at the top doesn't have bulk on it. Probably be more accurate if I did not trim that little angle with pinking shears, but you know. All right, so now I should be ready to turn this right side out. And let's see if it works out like I always like it to. The corners should be able to poke out fairly well because we took out a lot of bulk with the understitching up here. Okay, so I've got a pretty nice little flat corner here without bulk in it. Let me see about this side. Just going to pop it out a little bit. And it's the same thing here, nice and flat, not a whole bunch of bulk. And so when I iron it now, I'm going to iron the very top edge. Let me just go iron the top edge first. I want to iron it so at the very top, looking at it from the right side, remember the right side, the public side, is the one that does not have interfacing on this pattern. Okay, so I'm just going to iron this top part so that none of that stitching is visible. Okay, so with this iron now, and I'm looking at the wrong side here, if I go to press the sides, because we made the interfacing layer shorter, it's also going to want to roll this seam towards the underside. Even though there's not understitching technically and everything, it will naturally do that. So when I press it, I'm going to press it just like this so that that seam is only visible from the bottom of the collar. From the top of the collar, I don't see it, but it's still rolling over and holding that shape really nicely. Okay, now, excuse me, the last thing I need to do is adjust my seam allowance on here. I like to sew my collars with a very small seam allowance. It makes the whole process so much easier. And you can tell what the seam allowance is by the dots. So say I'm doing size large here and measuring from the center of that dot to the outside edge is 5/8 of an inch. Sometimes on some patterns they actually give you a smaller seam allowance and you don't really have to adjust it. This one, not so much. So on the collar, okay, this dot here is where they want our seam line to be, which is at 5/8. I don't want that. I want at the most 3/8 of an inch. But I wanted to wait until this point to trim it because when I understitched the top, it made it so that my very bottom edges were not even. So I am going to trim this whole bottom edge. I'm going to take a 1/4 inch off of it, straight across here. And then once I take the 1/4 inch off, then I'll come back and mark where my little double notches are. So I want to make sure at this point that this is very, very accurate. So I'm going to use my heat erasable pen, line up my ruler with a 1/4 inch mark, and just draw that line straight across here. And I am measuring from the bottom edge of the one that's sticking out the farthest, okay? So I've got my line drawn there. I'm going to go ahead and trim all of that off, just straight across, following it. And I just need to remember in my mind, I am using a small seam allowance, somewhere between a 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch, whatever it takes to make everything match up. But that's going to be my guideline. If you're using a fabric and it is just not going to want to sit still, at this point you can open it up, throw a little bit of stitch witchery in there, close it up, and iron it, and it's going to stay really nice. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that because why not? So I'm just going to lay it in here. Look at that, I picked the right size. How great is that? Okay, so I'm just going to lay it in there, take this carefully over to my ironing board and just press it, and that is just going to temporarily glue the edges of my collar together so I don't have to worry about it coming open as I sew it onto the band. So at this point I can line up this dot on my pattern with the edge of my sewn collar, and that's going to give me the point where I need to, I'm just going to mark on here the 2 notches where my collar is supposed to have notches, and I can do the same thing over on this side, and that should be good. If I fold this in half, those 2 should match up, so that's my double check. If it works on here, yep, they do match up, so I'm good here. So I'm going to set this aside for a minute and work on this band. The band is the same thing. It is too big. It is just too big. So what we're going to be doing is attaching the band to the collar and then attach that whole little assembly to the dress. So I'm going to work on the part up here where it attaches to the collar piece first. And just like the collar, I have one that has interfacing on it. I have one that does not. I'm going to layer these 2 together right here. Alright, so here it is. I've just roughly pinned it together, okay? I have my 2 little dots marked on the sides from here. Before I get started with anything, I will also need to trim this down. So just like I did with the other one, I'm going to come with my ruler and try to be very careful to make my marks accurate. Mark it at a 1/4 inch, both this side and the bottom side, okay? So I'm going to be taking off a 1/4 inch up here and down here. Okay, so I have it all trimmed now. So lining up my pattern piece with those dots, where are you little dots? There you are. I can see where the center back should be, which is right here, okay? So sliding, see I drew that line, so sliding my pattern down a little bit, I can see where these 2 notches should be. And I am just drawing them. My seam allowance is so small I don't really want to clip in there right now. But that is good enough. Alright, so I have put a little mark on my collar, on the right side of my collar, where the center back is. I have my little notches drawn too. So I have moved this one away, my pins over to the very edges. Raise you up. okay? And I'm going to need to set this inside of there like that. I'm just looking to make sure everything matches up. The edge of my collar, once it's inside of here, should be matched up with this dot right there. So I'm putting my collar down so I can see it easy. I've got my band that I have all of my markings on, and I'm just going to place that straight on top of my collar so my notches are matching up, so I can see that where this little dot is at the very edge of my collar right there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pin that on here, put a pin at center back right here, put a pin where those notches are matching up, which is right here. And the same thing on this side, making sure this dot matches up with the edge of the collar over here, and that these notches there are matching up. So now that that is done, the one that does not have all the markings and has no interfacing and it's just kind of hanging out here, I'm just going to sit it down, sit all this on top of it, and pin it on so it matches up with the edge of the band on top. Now, you should only have band between this dot and this dot. There should be no collar piece in between there. At this lower dot, I'm putting a pin straight across, folding this up, and that's going to give me a little bitty seam allowance type fold right there, okay? Put another pin up here through all of these layers. Now the same thing over on this side, making sure these two edges are matching up, the bottom one and the top one. Put a pin straight across at that bottom dot level, fold it up, and pin it across here. Get everything to line up, repin so I've got all the layers together here. And I will be sewing this from the edge all the way up and over at my small seam allowance, at somewhere between 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 inch, okay? Depends on how thick your fabric is and things like that. Okay, so now I'm done sewing that. Put my little thread out here. And so I can pull my collar out and it's going to go, here's my little narrow band, here's my collar. The band is actually very narrow. It's interesting. So what I'm going to do is really quickly go to my iron and press this so that on both sides of my collar, this band is facing down. I got so excited about my collar and everything, I completely forgot that I had not finished closing up my front band. I just put it on my dress form and completely forgot about it. So I need to do that before we can attach the collar, obviously. And there's a couple ways you can go about it. The one thing I want to mention is I'm going to be putting buttonholes in the band, and if there is a big thick drop off, sometimes my buttonholer will be disagreeable, and so this part underneath here I'm going to actually pink just the very edge of this so it's not one big drop off, so it's more of a, you know, pinked edge. So let me go ahead and trim that. I'm not going to cut it super short. Just going to come in here, you know, just about like that, and trim it all the way up on both sides. Okay, so I've got this edge here pinked, and I've decided the way I'm going to close this up is a couple things. First, I'm going to come and press this edge up so that I know for sure on the outside it looks right. I'll probably look at the outside while I'm pressing it just to get this trained to want to go up in here, okay? And then once it's pressed up, then I'm going to come back and press this so that I know that it is coming beyond my line of stitching, okay, just beyond it, and I am going to glue it down with stitch witchery all the way down, okay, because if I know for sure that it is beyond that row of stitching, then I can come back on this side and stitch in the ditch all the way along here to secure it, okay, and I'll show you all those steps. But if I don't have this really placed exactly, when I come back and stitch this way, I'll have big gaps, and nobody likes that. So first step is just to get this pressed, the seam allowance pressed up into here. So now that the seam allowance here is pressed in here and wanting to stay there, I'm going to start at the bottom on this side, and I can just carefully make sure this bottom edge is tucked in, get a little piece of my fusible bond, and just carefully lay it right on top of where that stitching line is, and just in a bit from there, and then I can put my band over that. And I'm just going to do one little piece at a time here. And now this is glued on, okay? So it actually looks like, because I understitched it, which is going to make it want to roll more this way, I will have absolutely no problem making sure that it reaches all the way over. It's going to want to have more room on this side, so that's not going to be a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep adding a little bit, step by step, all the way down. Okay, so over here at my machine, I am using my Stitch in the Ditch foot. It's got this cute little blade that goes as a guide down the ditch. It's a spring-loaded blade, so it just pops up and down. So anyhow, I'm just going to put that on. You don't need one of these, but it makes it easier to guide on. So with that in place, and with this is the wrong side, the stitch witchery is holding it in place here. I'm going to flip it now, so I am looking at the right side, and this way I don't need any pins or anything to get in my way. And I'm going to line up that little blade on my foot with the seam line here. Let me get a couple little stitches just to start it off, and it looks like we're right. Okay, so now I can just let that little guide follow my seam line. Hang on a sec. Got a lot of fabric here. Okay, so then if I just pull a piece of this back here, let's see if you can see, right here is my line of stitching, and it's just catching that edge just nicely. Don't need to worry about it, all is good. Okay, so now I think we're about ready to put the collar on. So here is my dress, got my little front band installed. It's got its little step up area there. And I am going to be sewing the non-interface side of the band, which is just below the understitched side here, okay? I'm going to be sewing this part of the band to the right side of my dress. So I have my center back marked, and right here are two dots. This little dot right there, and on the other side are these, and this dot lines up with the shoulder seam, so those are kind of important. So I'm just going to try to form this into shape, and actually before I sew this on, we're reducing seam allowances everywhere, so I actually need to trim down this seam allowance too. So this is my stay tape here, and it's got like almost like a twill tape type of a tape here. This is a bias tape, and it's fused on. All right, so I am trimming it at 1/4 inch, just eyeballing it at this point, but I'm trimming it so that I don't cut into where that twill tape type of part is. This should match up with our little collar a whole lot better now. So I'm going to lay it back down. matching up my center back here, which I have marked. I'm going to line that up with the center back of my yoke, and I can see that easy because I put the little cross-hatching pattern meeting at the center back there. Okay, so I'm going to pin that one, come over where the dots are, and I'm just going to stick a little pin straight through that dot so I can line it up right on my shoulder seam here. And kind of turn everything in that way. Do the same thing over here, where this dot, actually I can see it better this way, where this dot here is going to match up with that shoulder seam. Going to pin it into place. Then this very front edge here lines up with that little step up right there, and I want my collar piece to be just slightly longer so that it can wrap around it, because it's fairly thick, but you know, we're talking a millimeter or two. We don't want a big thing sticking out there. Okay, so I got that pin there. Same down here. Get this pinned over here. Now, I'm basically just going to average out everything in between. So, just kind of tucking it all in, smoothing it out, make it work. Like that. If it looks like one side is bigger and one side is smaller, just bend it. Let me show you. Hang on a second. Now, with this seam in particular, if you're not real confident that you can make it perfectly, hand baste it first. Okay? All right, so like see this part where it looks like this is a little bit bigger. It's not, it just looks like it. If I bend my whole fabric this way, it's gonna want to work itself together better. So then I can find the midpoint, pin it here, do it again over here, find that midpoint. Okay. And over here. And I will be sewing this with my sewing machine at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so let me finish pinning this little bit here, and I'll start up here and work my way down. So go nice and slow. You want to make sure your seam allowances are staying open, okay? You want to make sure you don't have puckers. When you're lining it up, what you really want is for this part to be just slightly lower than your fold, okay? So these two are going to be almost lined up, but this will be just tiny bit lower is what you want. Okay, so at this point I have this side sewed on. Now, part of the good thing about having a short seam allowance is that this is much more flexible and easy to work with. It's a lot more, I don't know, just friendly. So another good part about doing it this way is that when you sew on the fabric part, you can mold it better, okay? Which makes it easier to sew on first than the interfaced side, because that's a little more rigid. So on the outside, the side that the world sees, it's a lot easier to get a collar band sewed on without any puckers. Okay, so that's all good. Now on the inside, I'm just going to tuck this in. Remember, the pattern wanted me to tuck this in a long time ago. I said, no, I don't want to. Well, I want to now. And I want to very carefully tuck it so that it is just barely covering my stitching. Let's see if you can see here. So here's my stitching line, and I'm just pulling it down I'm just going to put it just beyond that and stick a pin there. Let me go ahead and do this the rest of the way across. But this is the inside now, and doing it this way, it's just my favorite. Now, over here at the very edge, we do have some thickness here because there is a lot of stuff going on. So at this point, on this part, just do the best you can to kind of tuck it in there. Remember, I placed the gray part, the collar band, just slightly outside of where this part was, just so that I would have enough room to wrap all the way around all of that stuff in there, because I don't want to trim it all the way to the seam allowance, because then there's a chance of fraying and a chance of things peeking out. So let me just put it like that, and I'm going to pin it down here. Just stabbed myself, as you do. Okay, so let me finish pinning this down, and I have not hand stitched anything yet on this project, and you know what, I think I'm actually going to hand stitch this down just because it's very curvy. So I will get a little needle and thread and just come in here and whip stitch this down. Okay, so I have my collar just whip stitched down. Really nice, invisible, it's gonna hold it. Happy with that. Now I need to put buttonholes on. So on this blouse, it looks like they are placing a button right up here at the very top. I am never gonna button that button, and I can tell you that that is gonna be putting a button right here. I don't wanna put a buttonhole there. Mostly because that's where my pretty little X that starts all this amazing matching going on, and you know, why interfere with that? So I'm going to start my button placement with this one, which looks like it is just about at the yoke level. So on this front band they have buttonhole markings, and I'm just going to line it up and put a little pin where the very top of their buttonhole is going to be. So there's one here, and so on and so forth. And I will be right back after I get this done. Okay, so I have all my little pins on. The buttons I'm going to use are just plain. They're actually very vintage, but they're just a plain little 4-hole button. It's kind of like a rounded back. You know, very, very normal. This calls for 5/8 inch buttons, and I think that's pretty much what that is. What I need to do is mark where all of these spots are, because if you're familiar with my buttonholer, I need a starting point and a track, and I'm going to use this line. So I'm just lining up the top of my ruler with where that pin is, making a yellow chalk line. I'm using yellow because I think that it will show up. And I know I can wipe it off. Putting it on and drawing them straight across here. Okay. Once I get this done, then I will come back and draw a line straight up the middle. And I am going to line my buttonholes up with the center of the pattern here. So I am going to call this the middle, okay? So like on this one, I'm going to start my buttonhole here and follow the track straight that way. And I'll just keep doing that, making letter T's all the way down. All right, so I got my buttonholer set up on my Singer 15 here, and I put the template in there for 5/8 of an inch, and I think that's going to work well with my button size. And I do need to go around twice. Once just wasn't good enough, so I'm going to go around the horn twice. And if you've never seen my buttonholer, I'll show you on one of these. But I do have a totally separate video that just goes step by step on everything to know about this little buttonholer. And they're nifty little things. So the first thing I need to do is get it lined up at the beginning of its circuit. And like I said, I needed a starting point and a track, okay? So I'm just going to line my needle up with my starting point here, which is basically where that line crosses the T, right there. Maybe scoot it over one hair. Okay, and make sure that this line at the end of my little gauge is lined up with my track line. Okay, let me get it started here. That is once. We're going to go around one more time. Okay, so now I can lift it up, pull it out here, and before I clip the threads, maybe you can see, well, let me try to clip these off here so you can. Makes a nice little buttonhole with curved edges and everything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and make the rest of them. Alrighty, so back here at my table, what I need to do is clip my threads from the buttonhole. I have a little scrap of fabric here. I get wet and I can rub that chalk mark off. And then I'm going to use my little chisel. I have a block of wood here. I need to turn it up on its side. And using my little chisel, excuse my big hand there, I'm going to cut it open, make sure my little button can pass through. And then come in here and rub my fingernail on there to get any little loose threads out. Clip them. And move on to the next one. Alright, so I've got all my buttonholes opened up and I need to mark where to sew my buttons. So to start off this whole process, what I need to do is carefully overlap my buttonhole side over the other one. I'm going to put a pin up here at the very top to hold that. At all of my key points that I really need the lines to match up, like right here, I want this line to match up over here. Okay, so I can adjust that just a bit. I'm going to put a pin through there just to hold it in place. I think I'm kind of moving everything out of the way that way. So just leaving this as it is, I want to make sure that this lines up where this lines up to this side. So when I put my ruler there, it'll go straight across. And put my pin here. Come on. Okay, to hold those together. And then there's one more spot down here that I'm going to need to line up. Put my ruler across here, and that lines up really well, just as it is. And put a pin straight across right there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is find something. I'm going to try with this. I need to make a little dot right in the middle of my button hole. You know, like halfway from the top and halfway from the bottom, right in the middle there. And I can see that, so that's good. I'm actually going to draw a line to it because that'll make it easier to see. Okay, so I draw a line straight across. And I'm going to do that with each buttonhole. Draw a little dot, make a line because it's easier for me to see. If this was a solid fabric, this would be a piece of cake, but it is not, so, you know. Let me finish like this all the way down. All right, so now that I have that marked, I can move that out of the way. And I hope you can see I have some little lines drawn across there. So if I look at my band, it's just under 1.5 inches wide. Okay, so half, let's say it's 1.25 inches. 1.25 inches is 5/8 and 5/8. Okay, So what I'm going to do is line up the edge of my ruler at 5/8, and everywhere there's a line, I'm going to draw a little hash mark going up, and that's going to make little crosses where I need to sew a button. So I got all those little X's marked all the way, and I'm just going to come back and sew a button right on top of each one. So it's getting late tonight and my hands hurt, and I usually don't do this, but I am going to sew my buttons on by machine tonight. So, you know, first time for everything on the video. This is a foot for putting buttons on. It just kind of holds it in place so that you have a good view of what you're doing. And I set my stitch length to 0. I play with my width of my zigzag to match what my holes are, and mine is about number 4, which is close to 4 millimeters between, but you know. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get my side here, and I want to line up where my X is, right under that foot, set my little button under there. And where that clamp is nice and big, let me see if I can move you in some here. Okay, so if you can see where this opening is really big, I can just set that button right on top of that little cross, move it in here, and set my foot straight down, and I can see where those holes are pretty clearly. And I go very slowly when I am sewing my buttons on, because it's very easy for the button to shift, and then you hit it and it either cracks or part of it flies around, and to me it's easier just to barely go a little bit above that. When I get about 10 or so, I lost track of how many that was, stitches, I lift it up, move it over so I can get the other 2, and set it back down and do about another 10 stitches. I'm going to just move it on down here. I'm not clipping it. I'm just going to have like one tail to the next. Get my next button, set it on my little X, set her down, make sure it's lined up. About 10 stitches or so. Move it up to the next one. Okay, then lift it up and move on down to the next button. So one of the problems with sewing buttons on by machine is that there is really not a knot on these things. It's just a thread that's wrapped around. And so there's a tendency for the buttons to slowly unravel and come off. And so what I do is basically, once I have them on here, come back with either like glue, or for me, you know, I'm using my clear nail polish that is my friend of friends in the sewing room. I'm just dabbing it on the threads to kind of glue them together so they're not going to want to come unraveled, and then let that dry. So this is it. I like it. I think that I took the belt off so you can see just how wide this is. Super wide, you know, but it's the belt that cinches it up, and on the pattern envelope it showed it with a belt, so you know that's the shaping mechanism. But if you just want a very big loose dress with no cinched in at the waist or something, go for it. And if you have a body shape that you know isn't picture perfect proportions and everything, it's very adjustable because it's just a belt to your size, so that's great. So the sleeves, cozy, you know, they're a good length. They're a little bit long, but they're like super poofy, and I kind of like that. And the size of the elastic that was in the guide that came with the pattern does do well up here, you know, and that's what I wanted because when I'm working I like to push my sleeves up, but coziness down here. This dress does not have pockets. I was thinking of putting them in as I was sewing them, but I held off because I wasn't sure exactly where they would lay. So if you're going to put inseam pockets, do it in this layer of the ruffle, because the belt wants to cinch it up. And even though it's a perfectly flat seam, because, you know, hips and everything, it makes it want to kind of curve up in the back, which is, you know, kind of a cute thing. But for pocket placement, I think down here inside this ruffle would work really good because it's full enough, you know, the pockets would disappear. There would be no bulk showing there and everything. And it's far enough below the belt because if you're not wearing a belt, that might feel a little bit low. But, you know, anyhow, I like it. It's very comfortable. It is kind of similar to the other one, but it's different enough that, you know, it's worth making. I like the yoke. And this yoke is not lined. You know, usually they're lined, but this one is not, and it made it a whole lot easier to put together. So if you're new to making yokes, this is a good one to start on. So anyway, that's it. Foggy day. The horses are hanging out on the foggy day, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and some spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful white houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.